Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into a concept that really challenges how we think about power, about voice, and, who gets heard. It's the idea of the subaltern. And that really provocative question from Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, can the subaltern speak?
Hmm.
Right, and this whole deep dive, it's built entirely on source material that one of our listeners, actually sent in. So our mission here is to pull out the most important stuff from this text, give you a clear handle on what's honestly a pretty complex but really crucial idea from post-colonial thought. Think of it as like your shortcut to getting this concept that shapes how we look at marginalized voices all over the world.
That's right. And while the term itself, it does have these academic roots, Spivak's take on it, her unique framing, has made it just central to understanding the dynamics of silencing of exclusion.
Yeah.
So we'll be digging into the definition, the key arguments she makes, and some of the, well, challenging implications. And it's all drawn directly from the text you shared with us.
Okay, so let's jump right in. This isn't just theory for theory's sake, is it?
No, not at all.
It's about these really fundamental questions like whose experiences actually get seen, whose stories end up being told, and maybe more importantly, whose voices might be perhaps totally unintentionally just erased. Let's see what this source material tells us.
Okay, so the source starts by tracing the word subaltern back. Originally, it was just a military term.
Oh, really?
Like, yeah, for a lower-ranking officer, someone below the main command structure. But then later, thinkers like Antonio Gramsci picked it up. He used it to talk about groups in society who are outside the main power structures.
The dominant ones.
Exactly. The oppressed, the marginalized,
Yeah.
people who were historically shut out of, say, mainstream politics
Yeah.
and often just left out of the official history books.
Right. And this is where the source says Spivak comes in and really shakes things up. She takes Gramsci's idea and transforms it quite radically.
She really does. Because the source emphasizes, for Spivak, it's not just about being poor or, disadvantaged. That's part of it, maybe, but not the core.
Okay, so what is the core distinction for her?
It's specifically about those whose voices are fundamentally just not heard or not understood within those dominant systems of meaning. It's not, and this is key, it's not that they're literally silent or can't speak. It's that their speech doesn't register as legible. That's the term the source uses. It can't be properly read or understood by what she calls the hegemonic power structure.
The main system of authority and influence that shapes society?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That system just doesn't have the tools or maybe the inclination to understand what they're saying.
So, okay, it's less about the volume of the voice, more about the reception. Like the system isn't tuned to that frequency, almost.
That's a good way to put it. Their voice exists, but the system lacks the framework to process it meaningfully.
Right. Which brings us then to the really central question of her big 1988 essay, the one that gets quoted all the time. Can the subaltern speak? It's designed to make you stop and think, isn't it? What do you, listening now, think her answer might be?
Well, as the source material lays it out, Spivak's answer is, well, it's a challenging no.
Whoa. Okay, no.
Yeah, and that's, where a lot of the debate kicks off. But the text is careful to explain why she says no. It's not about a physical inability to make sounds or form words.
Right.
It's because within what the source calls the dominant discursive structures.
Which means, like the accepted ways we talk and make meaning.
Exactly. The established ways we communicate, create meaning, decide what counts as valid knowledge, what makes sense. Within those structures, the subaltern voice just isn't received or recognized as meaningful speech.
Okay. And the source gives an example to make this clearer, right? A historical one from India.
Yes, it uses the very difficult example of sati, the historical practice where widows would sometimes immolate themselves on their husband's funeral pyre.
Okay. How does that illustrate the point?
Well, Spivak analyzes how the voices of the actual women involved in this practice were effectively silenced or, maybe more accurately, spoken over by more powerful groups. According to the source, you basically had two dominant narratives talking about these women, but not really hearing from them.
What were they?
On one hand, you had the British colonial rulers who outlawed the practice. Their narrative was often framed as saving Indian women. The source actually calls this a kind of colonial feminism.
Saving them, but on their terms.
Right. And on the other hand, you had some Indian nationalists who, in resisting colonialism, sometimes defended the practice as, part of tradition, part of their cultural identity against the British.
Okay, so two powerful groups debating about sati.
Exactly. And the crucial point, drawing straight from the source material here, is that in both of these dominant ways of talking about it, the colonial sating narrative and the nationalist tradition narrative, the actual women, the subalterns in this situation, their own perspectives, their reasons, their experiences, their voices, they were basically absent.
They weren't heard in the debate about them?
Precisely. They weren't factored into the actions taken or how the whole thing was recorded in history.
Wow. Okay. That really clarifies the no answer. It's not about silence, but about being spoken for or spoken over.
Exactly. And this leads right into another major point in the source. Spivak's critique of intellectuals, even the ones with good intentions, who try to speak for the subaltern.
Right. She calls them out.
She does. The source text mentions she specifically takes aim at certain Marxists, post-structuralists, and feminists, people who position themselves as representing marginalized groups. Her concern, as the source explains it, is that these intellectuals often don't fully recognize their own position.
Their own privilege or perspective.
Yeah, their social and intellectual standpoint, and how that position inevitably shapes or frames or maybe even distorts the voices they're trying to represent. They might unintentionally impose their own ideas, their own categories onto the people they're supposedly helping.
And the source says she engaged with big thinkers like Foucault and Deleuze on this.
Yes. It points out that she draws on their work, but also critiques them. Her critique, according to the source, is that they might sometimes assume that if you just removed the obvious structures of power, oppressed groups could then simply speak directly and freely.
Without realizing that representation itself is tricky.
Exactly. Without fully grappling with how the very act of representing someone else is tangled up in power dynamics.
And this connects to another key term the source brings up, epistemic violence. What's that about?
Right. Epistemic violence. Think of it like this. It's the way that knowledge itself, the way we understand the world, the concepts we use, the histories we tell, often shaped by dominant, maybe Western perspectives, can actually unintentionally erase or fundamentally misrepresent the experiences and ways of knowing of other groups.
So the tools we use to understand can actually cause harm.
In a way, yes. They can systematically silence or distort other realities, even when people are speaking or expressing themselves in their own terms. The dominant knowledge system just doesn't know how to register it correctly.
So tying it back to the listener, the source is arguing that even trying to help, trying to speak for marginalized groups could end up being another form of, well, silencing them.
Paradoxically, yes. It can become another form of domination, according to Spivak's argument in the source, rather than genuine liberation of their voice. It's a really challenging idea.
It definitely makes you pause and examine your own position when you engage with these issues.
Absolutely. And Spivak also shows, importantly, that this idea of the subaltern, it's not just one simple category.
It's not just about class, for example.
No. The source highlights that she argues it's not just about economic class or, say, the history of colonialism in a simple way. She brings other factors right into the center.
Like what?
Gender and caste are key examples the source mentions. She argues that subalternity is deeply layered, intersectional, we might say today.
Okay, layered. So give us the example from the source again.
Right, the source uses the example of a subaltern woman. She's facing marginalization on multiple fronts.
Doubly marginalized.
Exactly, not just as, say, a member of an oppressed class or caste, but also specifically because she is a woman within those structures facing particular forms of oppression and exclusion tied to her gender.
And because of these overlapping layers.
Well, the text notes that precisely because of this complexity, even when such individuals resist or try to assert their agency, those actions might be invisible, or they might be misinterpreted.
Or just not recognized at all by the dominant systems.
Right, because those systems are often designed in ways that literally cannot read or make sense of their specific layered experience. It's illegible again.
Okay. So this is obviously heavy stuff. What's the takeaway? What's the legacy of Spivak's work, according to the source material we're looking at?
Well, the source makes it clear her ideas have had a huge impact, just massive. They've profoundly influenced fields like post-colonial studies, feminist theory, decolonial thought, lots of areas grappling with power and voice.
In her perspective, what does it urge us to do? The source mentions something about humility.
Yes, radical humility. That's the phrase the source uses. Her work is presented as a critical warning against, romanticizing oppressed groups or assuming solidarity is easy.
So don't just jump in assuming you understand or can easily help.
Pretty much. It calls for this deep self-awareness and humility when people from positions of relative privilege, like academics, activists, maybe even us doing this deep dive, engage with marginalized subjects.
But that No answer. Can the subaltern speak? No.
It must have gotten pushback, right? The source mentions critiques.
Oh, absolutely. The source notes that critique. Some readers find her position too pessimistic. They ask, understandably, okay, if the subaltern cannot speak in a way that's heard by the dominant system, then what? What can actually be done? It seems like a dead end to some. Does the source offer Spivak's response to that pessimism?
It does give some insight. It says she doesn't really offer a simple checklist or a political strategy like do A, B, and C.
No easy answers.
No. Instead, the force says she encourages something more like a continuous practice, a persistent unlearning of privilege,
Learning privilege.
and a retraining of perception.
Retraining how we see and hear.
Exactly. So drawing from the text, the focus shifts. It's not about people from dominant positions trying harder to speak for the subaltern.
Okay, so what is the focus then?
The crucial work, as Spivak suggests via the source, is more about examining and trying to change the dominant systems themselves. It's about fostering environments, creating spaces where listening becomes possible in new ways.
Ah, so creating conditions where those unheard voices might potentially become legible, become recognizable.
That seems to be the direction the source points towards.
Yeah.
It's about enabling listening, not perfecting speaking for others.
Okay, wow. Let's try and quickly recap the main things we've pulled from this source material today then. It's been a lot.
It has.
We started with the concept of the subaltern, reframed by Spivak, not just as oppressed, but as those whose voices aren't legible, aren't understood within dominant systems.
Right. Then the big controversial question, can the subaltern speak? And her answer, no.
And we unpack the why behind that no, using the source's example of Sata, showing how women's voices got overridden by both colonial and nationalist narratives talking about them.
Then the critique of representation, how even well-meaning intellectuals trying to speak for others can unintentionally silence them, tied to that idea of epistemic violence.
The violence embedded in knowledge systems. And we saw subalternity isn't simple, it's layered, gender, caste, class, all intersecting.
Yeah, making experiences even harder to read sometimes.
And finally, her legacy. Not offering easy solutions, but calling for that radical humility, for unlearning privilege, and crucially, for focusing on creating spaces for listening rather than speaking for.
Yes. And as the source material really drives home this whole framework, this concept, it gives us a powerful lens, doesn't it? For understanding why certain people get excluded, why they're rendered invisible or unintelligible by the systems we live in.
Yeah.
It's a real challenge, directed at everyone, to think about our own place within those dynamics.
So thinking about you, the listener, especially the one who shared these sources, and really anyone grappling with these ideas, what does this all mean? I guess it forces us to get really critical about whose stories we actually hear, who gets the platform to tell them, and how the very ways we understand the world might, without us even realizing it, be amplifying some voices while just muting others or distorting them.
That's a great way to put it. And maybe a final thought to leave you with, building on that core tension of the source material we discussed. If Spivak's argument holds that speaking for the subaltern risks perpetuating their silence, then what does it genuinely mean to listen? Truly listen? And maybe what responsibility do each of us have in our own context to actively work on reshaping the spaces around us, the systems we're part of, so that those unheard voices might finally somehow become legible, might finally be heard?
Something to definitely consider as you go about your day.